So as part of my hop exploration series, I brewed the holy grail of hoppy beers, a heavily hopped New England IPA. So keeping with the pattern, I used 100% Simcoe hops in this beer. Does what I learned with brewing other batches with Simcoe translate into brewing a New England IPA? How did my New England IPA turn out? Well, stick around and let's find out. So I appreciate you stopping by Cascades Homebrew. My name is Brent. So I like drinking New England IPAs, or Hazy IPAs, or NEIPAs, or murky pond water, whatever you like to call them. I brewed a few in the past. Some of them turned out pretty good. Some of them, maybe not so good. So it's a tough style to pull off. They're process dependent, they're pretty expensive. Plus, I'm not quite sure what characters I would want in my own home-brewed New England IPA. So the goal of this video is not really about me brewing an award-winning New England IPA and then telling you all the secrets on how you can brew an award-winning New England IPA. Though the beer did turn out pretty decent, and I do feel like I have quite a bit of knowledge about the style. So there are quite a few nuggets in here if you want to learn about New England IPAs or if you just want to learn about brewing with Simcoe hops. So this was a good chance for me, one, to get a little bit more hands-on experience brewing some more New England IPAs, but really, the number one goal was just another chance to explore hop character more. So when I brewed that 100% Simcoe Pale Ale, I intentionally used just hops on the hot side. So I had hops in the boil and then hops at flame out. But in contrast, this beer moved all the hops to the cold side. There was a little charge at flame out, and then there was a big charge in a whirlpool or hop steep. And then there was another bigger charge in the dry hop. So I used a total of 8 ounces of hops in this 2.5 gallon batch. So that'd be the equivalent of a whole pound of hops in a 5 gallon batch, or 450 grams in a 19 liter batch. So that's a larger amount of hops than I've used in any of my prior batches of New England IPA. Let's get into the recipe and the brew day. So this is a 100% Simcoe New England IPA. I was targeting 2.7 gallons into the fermenter. It's about 10.2 liters. The calculated IBUs for this one were 35.3, color or very light 4.4 SRM. Note that 2.7 gallons is just a touch more than my usual target of 2.6 gallons. I also try to accommodate for a little bit more of the absorption of hops during the dry hop. So ideally I might go a little higher than that, but those 3 gallon fur monsters, I need a little bit of headspace, especially for this yeast that's known to create a lot of krausen. So I targeted this one at a 70% efficiency, which would give me an OG of 1069 and then a final gravity predicted at 1016. That would have gave me a 7.1% ABV. I got a little bit more attenuation and a little higher ABV at the end. So here's the water profile that I used. I think the real key for this style, at least most people say, is just building up that chloride to help give a little bit of mouthfeel. I went for about a 2-to-1 ratio, so I had twice as much chloride as I did sulfate. So adding in both some gypsum and some calcium chloride boosted up my calcium level to about 100, which I think is a fine level for the style. So note, I needed about 4 gallons total water for this batch. I split it up a little bit with a small amount for a sparge. That was partially just how much I could fit into my mash kettle, but then also I think the extra sparge will help boost efficiency a little bit. So I went ahead, I treated the total water volume with 1.8 milliliters of lactic acid at 88%, and then I set aside the volume needed for the sparge. So I treated the mash water with 1 gram of gypsum, 3 grams of calcium chloride, half of a Camden tablet to remove chlorine and chloramine. So looking back at the video, I should have added a Camden tablet to the entire water before removing the sparge water. Well, if it caused any issues, I haven't really noticed them in this batch. So once my strike water was up to temperature, I mixed in my grains. So this batch had 69% of an American Pale Ale. That's 5 pounds or 2.3 grams. I had about 12% of a white wheat malt, so 0.85 pounds or 386 grams. Had about the same 12% of flaked oats, in this case just using Quaker, so that's 0.85 pounds or 386 grams. Also had 7% of a Munich 1 from Weyermann, so that was half a pound or 227 grams. So I think the key points for the grain bill for this style are light colored base malt. Often you see Pilsner malt. I use 2-row. Some people use a pale ale malt like a Maris Otter. I think maybe it adds just a little too much color and a little bit too much grain flavor to the beer. Most people are using 15, maybe 30% even, of a high protein grain or malt, such as oats or wheat. So I went with that 7% Munich. I think it just adds a touch of complexity and just a touch of color to the grain bill. So it looks like I'm right on target. with my mash temperature at 152 degrees Fahrenheit or 66.7 degrees Celsius. So I let this go for 60 minutes. At the 30-minute mark, I'll give it a good stir and take a pH reading. My target was 5.4, but I measured closer to 5.55. This was one of my first few batches after switching from using 10% phosphoric acid over to using 88% lactic acid. So that 5.55, that's not too bad, and it's in a good range for mash conversion. So I don't make any adjustments, but I use what I learned to better calculate acid additions for future batches. Once the 60-minute mash was done, it was time to pull out the grain bag. As I mentioned earlier, this batch got a small sparge, so I needed that little extra bit of water for this one to make up for the losses to hops. I also know flaked oats will suck up water as well. I probably could have fit the entire volume in my kettle for a full volume mash, but I do know the sparge will boost efficiency. And that'll kind of help to offset the drop in efficiency from the losses to hops. So after draining most of the wort out of the grain bag, I move it over to the bucket where I stir in the sparge water. After letting that rest for 5 to 10 minutes, I come back to give it another stir, and then I drain the grain bag again. So after topping up the kettle, I'd appear to be right on target with my gravity and volume. Since this batch doesn't get any additions in the boil, I bring up the boil and just let it go. At the end of the 30-minute boil, I had my first hop addition. It was 1 ounce or 28 grams of Simcoe. Supposedly that would give me 10.3 IBUs. I gave the hops a good stir and let them steep for 5 minutes. This might have been a mistake. The beer ended up a bit more bitter than I expected. The recipe in Beersmith does have a 5-minute steep that's included in that IBU calculation. So after this 5-minute steep, I then moved the pot over to my sink to drop the temperature down to my target steep temperature, which is 180 degrees Fahrenheit or 82 degrees Celsius, and I want to steep it for 20 minutes. So looking at the timestamps on the video files, this added several more minutes. I think I know why I got so much bitter in the beer. I think I just left it steeping too much near boiling temperatures, or at least those hot temperatures that are extracting bitterness. But once I was down to a lower temperature, I added in my second hop addition. That was 3 ounces or 850 grams of Simcoe. This calculated to add 25 IBUs. I gave the hops a stir a few times during the 20-minute steep. By the end, the temperature of the wort had dropped to 162 degrees Fahrenheit or 72 degrees Celsius. I then chilled the wort down to my pitching target temperature. I transferred the wort into my 3-gallon Monster fermenter. So that 4 ounces of hops, it really swelled up. In the end, it looks like I got 2.6 gallons, or right at 10 liters, into the fermenter. I then pitched 1 pack of Lallemand Verdant dry yeast, just by sprinkling it on top of the chilled wort. Then the batch was moved to my fermentation chamber. I recently acquired a Wi-Fi enabled Inkbird temperature controller. The ability to monitor and change temperature while not at home has been quite handy. My fermentation plan for this batch was to hold it for about 3 days during active fermentation at 66 degrees Fahrenheit or 20 degrees Celsius. And then I raised it up to 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius once fermentation slowed down. The following morning, fermentation was very active. On day 2, there was a nice thick krausen, but looks like I avoided a blowout. On day 7, the beer looked to be in good shape to add my dry hops. I added a fairly sizable amount of hops to this one, 4 ounces, or 113 grams, again, of Simcoe hops. That's in the 8 pound per barrel range, or in grams per liter, it's a lot. So if my dry hopping process allows for enough oxygen to cause oxidation issues, I have not noticed. But after 2 days, it was time to cold crash. And just like magic, I pushed a few buttons on my phone and started the process. So I'd planned for a 2-day cold crash, but after 3 days, I had time to transfer into my purged keg. Man, there was a lot of trub, yeast, and hops in the bottom of the fermenter. I had a couple minor hiccups during the kegging, but overall, it went smoothly. Well, kind of smooth. So looking at the final stats on this, my efficiency ended up being pretty much on target. Original gravity, just a couple points above the original gravity, but I had a little bit more volume. The attenuation was a little higher than predicted, so I finished at 1012, and that gave me a 7.9% ABV beer. Okay, that's enough talking about the recipe and brew day. Let's get on to tasting this beer. Dun-dun! So there's the beer. Hopefully the lighting down here does the beer justice. It's a beautiful color, very nice, light, a little bit of kind of some orange hint to it, but it's definitely nice, pretty color. It's got about the exact same color I'm looking for. No, this beer has been in the keg for about 6 weeks. Sometimes I see pictures of people posting up hazy beers. I mean, now most of my beers are hazy in the first week when I just put them in the keg, but this one has a really nice, stable haze to it. So if you like your beers hazy, whatever I did worked out pretty well. I think it's just a combination of the yeast, the hops, the grain bill. So one thing I'll note, part of the reason we're at 6 weeks, and not just like 1 or 2 weeks, for the first 1, 2, probably I think up to about 3 weeks, the beer really had a bit of an astringency to it. So my girlfriend and I, we register bitterness differently. She likes New England IPAs. Sometimes she'll have those ones that are just really heavily dry hopped, and to me, they're often this kind of harsh, astringent bitterness that she doesn't get. On the other hand, I'll have an IPA that I think is maybe just mildly bitter, and she thinks it's really bitter. Well, for the first several weeks, this one kind of had both of those. I got that astringent bitterness, she got the bitterness. I think maybe she got the astringency as well. So I was a little bit worried, but after 2, 3 weeks, it started to fade, and it actually became a pretty decent beer. So what about the aroma on it? Oh, yeah, it's hoppy. There's a lot of hop aroma. Just a lot of kind of really nice juicy, again, I probably say the word pineapple more than because that's probably one of the few, but that nice tropical, a little bit of a dank. There's definitely a little bit of a kind of pine citrus in there as well from the Simcoe hops. So I can definitely see why Simcoe is such a popular hop in hazy IPAs or New England IPAs. But how's it taste? It's actually quite a nice beer. It's changed a bit. Again, 6 weeks. I think some of the hop character has faded. It kind of peaked a little bit. It's probably a little bit on the downside, but definitely tastes really nice. There's a lot of hoppiness to it. So the bitterness level on this one, I think it's just more than I like. I took it to a homebrew club meeting. I think people were kind of on the fence whether it was too much bitterness or if it was just the right amount of bitterness. It's got the level of bitterness you might expect kind of in an IPA. I think I like my New England IPAs just a little bit less of that bitterness. So as I mentioned, I think I just left the hops too long at that hot temperature and extracted too much bitterness. So I think that was just kind of a process issue on me, not so much the recipe, but how I executed it. So the mouthfeel is definitely about right on par with what I'm looking for. I wouldn't say it's thick, but it's definitely got that full creaminess. Just a really nice drinking beer. So part of my goal of brewing this was try to evaluate, did the lessons I learned from making the Simcoe hop sampler, making the Simcoe Pale Ale, did that translate into what you would expect for using those hops in a New England IPA? And I would say, yeah, to some extent. Definitely the intensity of the hops, the level of the hopping in this beer is significantly more than those, but I think some of those same characters apply, even though it's a quite different beer. I do think some of those same lessons apply, kind of the flavors. It's just much more intense hop flavor aroma in this beer than the other ones. So would I recommend you run out and make a 100% Simcoe New England IPA? I'm not quite sure. It's a pretty enjoyable beer, but I think it would be much better with another hop that added a little bit more some kind of bright, fruity, juicy. Definitely you can see why Citra is so popular, but like a Citra, an Alvarado, a Mosaic. So I think that's one thing you'll see in some New England IPA recipes. Sometimes maybe they'll slip in a little bit of a classic American hop, but they usually combine it more with some of those newer hops. Although I guess Simcoe and Citra are probably about the same genre. Hopefully in the future I can cycle back, put a little bit more effort in trying to brew New England IPAs. Like I say, they're a style I like. I'm just trying to find my way a little bit and exactly what character I would like in a New England IPA. I think the ABV on this one is probably a little higher than what I would want, at least for a beer on tap at home. So if you're enjoying what I'm doing with the Hop Exploration series, well, make sure you come back and check out my channel. I've got more things planned. Check out my playlist for what I've already done. And while you're here, make sure you click that like button. Click the subscribe button so you get notified of my future content. So my hope is that I can help you build great beer. Cheers!